Commemorating an unlikely World War II survivor and hero, an unknown true story about a Polish Lithuanian boy. I wish to acknowledge there are millions of stories about World War II, as you will all have possibly read novels, seen movies, or read history books about the amazing courage and sacrifices displayed by many people. There are, of course, also thousands of brave people who are known as war heroes. These stories never get old, and World War II stories are still being shared and published today in new movies and books, especially in the lead up to the 80th anniversary. There was so much loss, suffering, and sacrifices, but amongst all the darkness, such as the Holocaust, the loss of 6 million Jews and 11 million other groups, lives lost in prisoner of war camps, bombings of cities, suffering of men and women away at war, evacuation of children, food shortages, disease, and so forth, there were also stories of hope. I would now like to share one of the more unusual stories from my family. Today, I'm commemorating an unlikely survivor and hero. His name was Artur Zielinski. He was born in Lithuania to Polish and Lithuanian parents. His war years have remained mostly a secret. As confirmed by letters received from past colleagues, students, and family members, such as the one on the screen here. He was a person that would not be considered a traditional hero, but as a survivor of World War II, he was courageous, brave, and faced amazing conflicts, trauma, and sadness, but also success beyond the war. Artur Zielinski was my father-in-law. I never met him and yet was fascinated by his past history. I decided to write a book as the plight of ethnically Polish families living in Lithuania during the war has rarely been reported or shared. After his wife died, we found a hidden diary which revealed part of his wartime challenges. I was also lucky to speak with Polish relatives that knew Artur during World War II and was able to provide information on the family history. The book has been written as a fast-paced historical fiction novel that follows the path of not only Artur, but also his mother and family. Today, I plan to share the true facts of Artur's life story, which differs from the novel, and there are some spoilers. So whilst Artur was not unique, his fate was similar to many Eastern European boys and men, but their stories have not been shared. I've heard from those who returned or remained in Lithuania that if they had shared what had passed during World War II, they would have been shot. So I hope by making this presentation today, I can pay tribute to them. There's been many changes in Lithuania. In 1939, Hitler and Stalin secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. Lithuania was allotted to Stalin and was absorbed into the Soviet Union in 1940 after a sham election in which the Stalin-backed party was the only one on the ballot. The Soviets nationalized farms and businesses, removed food to Russia, and deported intelligentsia to Siberia or had them executed. Those deported were transported to Russia by train, often in cattle cars with no amenities. The journey often lasted weeks, if not months. The conditions were unsanitary, passengers often lacked food and water, and many people died. In 1941, the Germans invaded and at first were widely welcomed as liberators from the Soviets. The Lithuanians had hoped to re-establish independence or gain some autonomy, but sadly that was not the case. 250,000 Jews had lived in Lithuania, and the genocide rate of Jews in Lithuania was up to 95 to 97%, the highest in Europe. Artur's father was a tailor in Kaunas and ran a workshop to produce clothing. He had 3 brothers. Due to major food shortages, the Russians had sent Lithuanian foods and goods to Russia, as did the Germans. Sadly, his eldest brother, who had signed up with the Lithuanian army, was killed early in the war. His mother struggled to feed her family. As a result, Artur was sent to live with his grandmother. Earlier at school, the Nazis had visited schools and conscripted Lithuanian boys aged 16 to join them. Artur's brother had escaped out of a school toilet window and then spent their time hiding and hunting for food in the local woods to help feed the family. However, when Artur was only 14 years old, he was informed that Polish boys could no longer attend school. So, in late 1943, propaganda posters were pasted around in Lithuania, as shown on the slide. And the translation says, "The German soldier is fighting for you. Work for him." Male students born between 1926 and 1929, so that's 13 to 16-year-olds, were approached at school and on the street. Artur was given the choice: sign up and join the Wehrmacht or agree to go to a labor camp. If not, he and his family would potentially face death. Not much of a choice, so he opted to join his family. Artur bid goodbye to his family, not knowing when he would ever see them again. He was transported by train or truck to Berlin and was secretly hoping to return within 1 year if war ended. At war, only 14 years old. At first, he was sent to Berlin for training and work selection, where he was part of the Legionärsbeerreich, which was a transport legion. Discipline was brutal, with regular executions of those that disobeyed or attempted escape. Some boys were sent to work with the German Air Force as anti-aircraft assistants. Some were sent to the Eastern Front to fight. Others sent to northern France to build the Atlantic Wall, and unlucky boys were sent to labor camps. Once Artur completed his training and, perhaps unusually, was sent to Paris as a truck delivery driver. Here he delivered supplies to German troops. Imagine a 14-year-old boy driving down the Champs-Élysées. Due to Hitler's instructions to get more troops along the coast, in early June 1944, he was sent to Lorient, Brittany, with a group of young men aged 16 to 18 years. The group were mainly conscripts or volunteers from the Soviet Union and other eastern territories occupied by Germany. Artur was given a gun and placed on guard duty to safeguard the German U-boats and bunkers. The bunkers had been massively reinforced and rebuilt in 1940, with roofs that were 5 meters thick. Apparently, the only bomb able to destroy the pens was a Grand Slam bomb designed by the British inventor Barnes Wallis. Nevertheless, the base deemed indestructible and is the reason Lorient was subjected to heavy bombing from Allied aircraft, transforming and flattening the nearby city. The Allies flew more than 2,000 sorties, shelling and bombing the site. Sadly, 135 bombers and 119 aircraft were lost by the British and Americans. So you can imagine the terror and noise as the site was continually attacked. Due to widespread hunger and even starvation that many faced, including Artur's family in Lithuania, Archer felt at least working for the Germans he would be fed. However, even the Germans were struggling to feed their troops from the end of 1943, and rations were meagre, as were other shortages such as gas and fuel for vehicles and aircraft. How to escape? The Allies launched a major propaganda campaign, dropping leaflets to conscripted Poles. It says, "If you must shoot, miss. Come over to the Allies and join your Polish brothers in arms who are waiting for you." It was very effective, but how could the lads escape? Shortly after the 1944 D-Day invasion, security was slightly reduced around the U-boat base and their camp in Camperley, Brittany, and Archer and his three friends knew this could be their chance to flee. In late July 1944, the American Operation Cobra push in Normandy was successfully penetrating towards southern towns in Normandy and eventually Brittany. Around this time, Archer and friends were transferred to Rennes due to the need for more support to guard the naval supply depots that were here, that comprised storage of food, fuel, and vehicles. As progress of the invasion and subsequent success increased, the Americans proceeded to bomb this area, hoping to bring an end to the war. Due to tension and chaos that the D-Day invasion created, Archer encouraged his three friends to attempt to escape with him. It was risky due to the number of Germans on guard around the surrounding landscape, and because if caught, they would have all been shot. Indeed, this was a serious threat, as the Germans executed at least 22,000 deserters. However, they decided to try their luck and jump off the back of one of the trucks on the way back to camp. Unfortunately, the German army were hidden around the many farms and small villages. As you can see in this photo, plots of land were divided by ancient rows of dirt alongside irrigation ditches. Thick vegetation and dirt mounds that could create walls up to 4.8 meters high, making it highly risky for Archer, but also difficult for the Allies to invade. Having jumped off a truck, they hid in nearby fields and farms, and then they were shot at by a French farmer. They had learnt sufficient French to explain they were Polish and asked for his help. Luckily for them, the farmer agreed to introduce them to members of the French resistance fighters, known as FFI, Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur. For the next few days, and perhaps weeks, the lads experienced a nerve-wracking period as they hid in ditches, haystacks, outbuildings, and they were also passed from safe house to safe house in Brittany and finally ended up on the Normandy border. Here, they enjoyed their first glass of alcohol called Calvados, an apple brandy, which they drank hidden in a barn. The map here highlights the locations from where they escaped from Rennes to Avranches, a town near Mont-Saint-Michel, which is an approximate 70-kilometer journey. During their escape, they stumbled over some terrifying scenes. Many dead bodies, they had to avoid landmines, as well as ducking and diving as bombing attacks took place. If you search for Operation Cobra on YouTube, you will find video footage taken during World War II. The deafening noise from the guns and bombs alone are quite frightening and will give you an idea of the atmosphere surrounding those unfortunate to be in that area during that time. Decisions. The French resistance told them their only chance to get to the UK and join the Polish forces was to be surrendered as a prisoner of war. Though not ideal, Archer felt it was the best option to reach Britain and join the Polish army. So they crossed their fingers and hoped for the best. As a result, in August 1944, they ventured into the dangerous area around Avranches, Normandy, where they met one more young 19-year-old German deserter who was also Polish and had been conscripted against his will. Meanwhile, on August 2nd, the Third Army of General Patton continued its progress in Brittany, and Mont Saint-Michel was liberated. The next day, near Avranches, the now group of 5 were confronted by American soldiers who did not kill them but began to beat them up and rob them. The young men were screaming in Polish, and thankfully one of the American soldiers with Polish heritage could understand what they were saying and managed to rescue them. They were now arrested as POWs and waited transport in temporary accommodation before sailing to Southampton in the UK towards the end of August 1944. In Normandy, with much apprehension, they waited with hundreds of other prisoners. Many were also from the East who had been pressed into service from Poland, Lithuania, Italy, and the Ukraine. American soldiers reported that many of the so-called German soldiers were as young as 13 years old. The young men in Artur's group, aged 14 to 19, were taken to the POW camp called Le Marchand d'Avies, Wiltshire. They had to be careful not to reveal they were Polish or complain too much, otherwise they could have been killed by the other German prisoners on suspicion of being spies. They were all graded according to their Nazi leanings or anti-Nazi viewpoints. Those with low risk were required to work on local farms. After 1 month in the POW camp, because Artur was only 15, he was sent to a displaced persons camp in London, where he spent 1 or 2 miserable months in a damp tent with other refugees. His older friends were sent directly to join the Polish forces in Scotland. At night, he could hear the V-1 rockets buzzing overhead before exploding in London. He joked at the end of the war he had been bombed by all sides. What could he do now? He certainly did not want to spend the rest of the war in this DP camp. Artur discovered that at 16 years old you could request to join the Polish forces, which he promptly did. His request was accepted and he was sent to Scotland to join the 1st Corps, where he assisted with coastal defence duties as well as driving duties. He was delighted to be reunited with his older friends that had been immediately transferred from the POW. At last, he felt he was contributing to the war in a positive way. In fact, you might be surprised to learn that 89,000 Polish men in the Polish forces had originally been conscripted in some way to be in the German army. 1945, end of war. War ended and everyone was happy that the war was over. Or were they? Whilst the Poles constituted the 4th largest of the Allies, they did not take part in the end-of-war victory parade in 1946. Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin had divided Europe up for themselves, using Polish soldiers as pawns. They had fought hard for their homeland, only to lose out. After 60 years, on the 10th of July 2005, the Poles were finally invited to lead the parade, sadly far too late for most of the men involved who had by then died. I thought I would remind everyone about the appalling death toll during World War II. It is estimated that between 70 and 85 million people died, 50 to 56 million deaths caused by war, and the rest due to disease and famine. The countries with the highest death counts are recorded on the slide, but of particular note is Lithuania. a country that was neutral at the start of the war, but sadly invaded by both Russia and Germany. They lost 14% of their population, one of the highest percentages during World War II. So now, post-war Britain. 3 decisions faced the young Polish men. 1. Go home. Ernest Bevin, in fact, issued this statement to the Polish forces. Speaking on behalf of the British government, I declare that it is in the best interests of Poland that you should return to her now, as she requires the help of all her sons in the arduous task of reconstruction. Of course, had they returned, they could have been shot or sent to Siberia, as many were. 2. They could remain and find a local job, such as working in a brick factory. Only approved jobs were offered to Poles to appease the trade unions who were concerned that these new immigrants would take British men's jobs. Or get educated. The British government offered education opportunities for those with the Polish resettlement corps. Once the government accepted, they could not all go back home. Polish refugees became one of the most prosperous immigrant groups in the UK after World War II. However, there was still prejudice and racial tensions towards the Poles. Finding work was challenging, as the input from the Poles during the war was quickly forgotten. The end of war dilemma was real. On the screen here is a quote from one Polish soldier who laments the injustice of not being able to return home. Out of approximately 250,000 Polish soldiers in the West in 1945, 105,000 did return to Poland. However, those soldiers returning home were quite literally committing suicide. Such was the difficult decision of the time. What was happening in Lithuania? Unbeknown to Artur, his Polish family was expelled from their home and business and forced to migrate to their supposed country of origin. Although Artur's father was Lithuanian, his mother and brothers were deemed Polish, and so they left Lithuania and moved to Gdansk. They took one of the last trains out. 400,000 Polish Lithuanians had applied for visas, but only 150,000 were able to leave. During the journey, his father became ill and had to get off the train at Grodno, which is now in Belarus, where he later died due to poor health. His mother and 2 brothers continued to Poland. In Gdansk, the Germans were retreating from the city that was known to them as Danzig, and the Russians were invading. There was bombings, killings, rape, food shortages, and much more. After the war, Artur's mother desperately tried to find her son to no avail. She felt certain he would return to Lithuania or Poland if he had survived the war. Life was very grim for Artur's mother, leaving her home, her husband dying, moving to a bombed-out city, very little food, and the need for her sons to find work. Plus, the heartache of not knowing where her youngest son was and whether he was alive or dead. At the end of World War II, Russia made claims to many countries to form the USSR, and the countries are listed on the slide here. Artur was in the UK and his family were now in Poland. How on earth could they find each other? The Red Cross was invaluable to many people trying to find their loved ones after the war. With a staggering 14 million inquiries received and just over 50% being resolved, remember, this was all paper-based with no computers. Today, they still receive over 8,000 inquiries each year. Artur's mother had only registered to seek Artur in Lithuania and Poland, as she felt certain if he had survived, he would have returned. Luckily for her, after 16 years later, she decided to update and extend the search in America, Canada, France, and the UK. Meanwhile, Artur was only hunting in Lithuania, but he later added Poland to his request. On this slide, I show the many symptoms that men returning from war experienced. Many suffered from PTSD or had breakdowns after the war, or were irreparably damaged by imprisonment. Prisoner of war trauma and survivor guilt rested heavy with many prisoners. Many turned to drink, drugs, or sadly overdose to cope. Back to Artur's new choices. He was now alone in the UK. Remember, he's still a young man of 16 years. And therefore, he decided to remain in the UK and secure an education to help him find meaningful work. He was a bright boy who could speak 5 languages, so learning English proved no challenge. He completed his high school studies and later studied for an economics degree in Scotland. At first, he was an English teacher to other immigrants and Polish soldiers. He briefly became a Russian translator for the BBC and then worked for Schweppes as an accountant. Due to war trauma and PTSD, one of his friends committed suicide, and he decided he would study to be a psychologist in the hope he could be more helpful to his colleagues and friends in the future. Artur and his friends found they were unsuccessful applying for work and felt this was due to prejudice towards Polish men. They decided to change their name, and his friends chose Welsh names such as Talbot and Glyn on the basis that their accent might be mistaken for being Welsh. No doubt a mistake, but Artur registered his surname as Arthur, and like magic, he was able to secure meaningful work. 18 years later, Artur did further study and earn a PhD in psychology, where he also met his future wife. In his new role as an assistant lecturer at the Maudsley Hospital, he had the opportunity to instruct an international range of graduate students in the fields of both psychology and psychiatry. In early 1962, he finally received a letter from the Red Cross informing him they had located his mother and brother in Poland. It had been 18 years since he was taken away from Lithuania, and now at 35 years old, he was determined to return and catch up. He decided to travel to Warsaw, not realizing the risk he was taking. On arrival, he was detained for 5 hours. As his wife told me, they were quite naive, but eventually he was approved to visit. I think you can imagine the joy of this reunion. However, it was a bittersweet moment, as Dr. Arthur had just accepted a new role as Associate Professor at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and later he was headhunted by Queen's University Canada to be the Director and Professor of their graduate program in clinical psychology. Artur remembered his pledge to help friends who suffered with stress during the war. One of the many papers he published was entitled The Stress of Predictable and Unpredictable Shock in 1986. This was a significant contribution to his theory of stress. It became a classic in its field. To conclude, Artur never met his mother again, but she died content knowing her youngest son had survived and was living happily in the West. He was able, though, to meet his brother one more time. A quote from the close of my novel is shown on the slide above. There was no way to turn the clock back and make amends. They were all victims of the rotten war that took lives, stole families and cities, and impacted so many with momentous events and consequences. There was no option to rewind history and re-record. Like so many young Polish or Lithuanian men, Artur had an extraordinary and deeply traumatic experience at a very young age. His youth that should have been filled with happiness was replaced with horror, desperation, and fear. I declare Artur was a survivor and a hero to some. He was an amazingly strong young man who experienced the horrors of World War II but worked hard to get educated, survive alone at such a young age, and in his profession help others by teaching a new generation of psychologists who in turn taught and help others. As mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, a fictionalized version of his life, together with his mother and family, is available from Amazon as a low-cost ebook or paperback book. I should add that for the presentation today, I have focused on Artur's life, but in the novel, I've dedicated around 40% of the book to share the struggles and challenges of living in Lithuania and Poland during World War II and the post-war years. Such information was supplied to me by family members who lived in Poland during this time frame. The novel also has book club questions, student classroom exercises, as well as an addendum that I added to a later issue. And this was once I discovered more facts about the real story. In fact, after I published this book, quite excitingly, and in a surprise turn of events, I heard from a retired journalist in the UK who told me her father, Henryk Kozłowski, later known as Henry Talbot, who was in fact a great friend of Artur and had been his best man at his wedding. More interestingly was the fact that he had been one of the people who had escaped with Artur in France. She was able to provide more factual content such as dates, locations, and this information has been included in the addendum featured in the latest edition of the book. So, would you have made the same decisions? Would you have attempted an escape? Would you have surrendered as a prisoner of war? Would you have signed up to join the Polish forces? And would you have remained in the UK after the war? Now that you have learned about Artur's odyssey and challenges, here is food for thought. To close, I thought I would share this famous quote. Many people have effectively used this in speeches and writings. One such paraphrase is the following: "We can learn from history, but we can also deceive ourselves when we selectively take evidence from the past to justify what we have made up our minds to do." I think this seems particularly poignant based on what's happening in the world today. Thank you.